Hi, friends. Hello, welcome. Here we are just staring blankly at the camera, waiting for the okay to go. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to our Bible study live for October. Goodness, it's October already. Um, let's see. We've got Jeannie and Eden and Carolyn and Hans all in the chat. Hello, it's good to see you there. My name is Austin Hartke. I'm the executive director here at Transmission Ministry Collective, and I'm joined by two really wonderful folks. Micah, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Micah Melody. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the community care coordinator here at TMC.
And
And
I'm
Peter.
Peter. Yeah, Peter. Pronouns are they, them, and I'm the Development and Communications Coordinator at TMC.
Yay. This is the first time we've been all back together on a Bible study for a minute, because last month it was just the two of you. And so the month before it was the three of us, but we didn't have our wonderful tech person, Sophia. So shout out to Sophia, who's in the background tonight, helping us with our tech and making everything look a lot nicer than when we try to do it ourselves.
Yes, thank you so much. It helps so much.
Yeah. So hello, everyone, and welcome to our Bible study. Oh, Eden, I'm sorry to see that you have to go, but that is totally okay. We're glad you got to step in for a second anyways. Um, we are talking tonight about a story in the New Testament. We are talking about Luke chapter 4. So if you have a Bible around you or a screen around you in which you can search for a Bible passage, we are looking at Luke chapter 4, verses 1 through 30. So we have two sort of very connected stories that we're going to be looking at tonight in this first part of Luke 4. So we're going to kind of talk a little bit about the background of the story, and then we're going to get into it. So, Micah, why don't you give us the background of what's going on in the Gospel of Luke prior to Luke 4?
Yeah, so we're starting at the very beginning of Luke 4. So right before this, in Luke 3, the beginning of the chapter of Luke 3 starts out with the baptism of Jesus. So this is when John the Baptist baptizes Jesus and in the Jordan River. And of course, there's the famous image of the dove, of the Holy Spirit in the form of the Spirit of God in the form of a dove descending on Jesus as the voice of God declares, "This is my beloved son." And so there's this beautiful image of like Jesus kind of being baptized in power in the Holy Spirit, as well as just God declaring that this is who you are, and this is to everyone, this is who Jesus is. And then immediately after the baptism and kind of what happens there, Luke actually goes into a genealogy, which is interesting that a lot of, thinking about like for other like gospels that open with the genealogy, this one, the genealogy here is God saying, "This is my beloved son." And then it's really interesting because it says Jesus, son of um, Joseph, son of, and it keeps tracing all the way back to eventually back to David, and then back to Abraham, and then back to Adam. And then it says Adam, son of God. So it's like this, like Jesus, son of God, Adam, son of God, this like really strong sense of this is who Jesus is. So that's where we're starting. There's been this declaration of Jesus's identity very publicly. And that's where we're entering into this passage.
Yeah, and that tension of son of God versus son of Joseph shows up again in the story that we're reading today. So we're going to get into that a little bit more too, those family ties.
And hi, Nettle, welcome in.
Yay. Hi, Nettle. Good to see you. So like we said, we're reading Luke chapter 4, verses 1 through 30. So grab a Bible or grab a link if you need one to that Bible text, and we're going to read it together. We are going to start out reading just verses 1 through 13. So why don't we do that? What are we all reading from tonight? What translation are we reading from?
I have, sorry, Peter, go for it.
I've got the I've got the Common English Bible.
Cool.
I'm reading out of the NRSV updated edition, which I think I stole from you, Austin.
Yeah, that's my go-to. So and Common English is, I always like to see what they do with that one as well. So those are two really interesting translations. Let's see. I think I'll go with I'll go with the English Standard Version, and we'll see what that looks like. So we're all reading different versions here.
And I see Amory says the Greek interlinear, which is
nice.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, love an interlinear. So let's read verses 1 through 13. Peter, why don't you go ahead and read that for us?
Sure. So this is Luke 4, 1 through 13. Jesus returned from the Jordan River full of the Holy Spirit and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. There he was tempted for 40 days by the devil. He ate nothing during those days, and afterward Jesus was starving. The devil said to him, "Since you are God's son, command this stone to become a loaf of bread." Jesus replied, "It's written, people won't live only by bread." Next, the devil led him to a high place and showed him in a single instant all the kingdoms of the world. The devil said, "I will give you this whole domain and the glory of all these kingdoms. It's been entrusted to me, and I can give it to anyone I want. Therefore, if you will worship me, it will all be yours." Jesus answered, "It's written, you will worship the Lord your God and serve only him." The devil brought him into Jerusalem and stood him at the highest point of the temple. He said to him, "Since you are God's son, throw yourself down from here. For it's written, he will command his angels concerning you to protect you, and they will take you up in their hands so that you won't hit your foot on a stone." Jesus answered, "It's been said, don't test the Lord your God." After finishing every temptation, the devil departed from him until the next opportunity.
So getting right in with an interesting text where of Jesus and the devil having an argument. I was just talking to somebody today who said that when they had like read this story at some point when they were like young in Bible school, and went to their teacher and said like, "Hey, what do we do about that whole story with Jesus and the devil arguing?" And they were like a young kid at the time, and the Bible school teacher was like, "What are you talking about? I don't know if that's really in the Bible," and like didn't know how to address it at all. And I feel like that's sometimes we don't know how to deal with stories where the devil shows up. We're not sure what to do with that or how to deal with those. So whether you're somebody who reads this and reads it as in a specific with a specific read on what or who the devil is, it's an interesting sort of like lens of that we bring to our scripture readings. So we've got this moment where Jesus is talking to the devil, and the devil says, now, Peter, your version I noticed was different from mine. What does your verse 3 say, the first part of verse 3?
Yeah, the devil said to him, "Since you are God's son, command this
Yeah.
stone to become a loaf of bread." I noticed that difference too, because I think yours says, "If you are God's son," or "if you are the
Yep.
son of man."
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think
commonly
Carolyn
English
just
says
pointed
if.
that out in the chat too.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yep. So since you are the son of God, or if you are the son of God, and since versus if is a big difference. You're right, Carolyn. So we've got an interesting difference there. So that was the first thing when I was reading the story. That was the first thing that jumped out at me is we've got this interesting thing where in the first and third temptations that the devil shows Jesus, the devil says, "If you are the son of God," or since you are the son of God, right? And for some reason, it's not in that second one. Why, I wonder? I don't know. But it's in the first and third one. And so it seems to be that that the devil is really harping on this idea of like, if you really are who you say you are or who people think you are, you should be able to do X. And so it's like really playing on Jesus's identity. And so it's coming out of that moment of baptism, of Jesus's baptism story and the dove descending. Like clearly this idea of like Jesus being God's son is something that is being argued about. I'm just looking at the chat here. Just noticing people talking about those translation experiences. Very cool. So the other thing I noticed here is that when Jesus says, "Do not put the Lord your God to the test," all these responses that Jesus has, they're all three quotes from Deuteronomy. So Jesus is going to like the foundational documents of Hebrew identity in Deuteronomy to answer these questions from the devil, right? But the one where Jesus says, "You shall not put the Lord your God to the test," in that last answer, it's not unusual to read that as possibly Jesus referring to himself in that moment as well as God the Creator or God the Father. Because this is the last thing the devil does, right? The very last thing Jesus says is, you shouldn't test God. And then the devil leaves after having tested God. So it's an interesting thing where Jesus could be referencing just that verse in Deuteronomy about like, don't test God the Creator. But it could be that Jesus is also applying that to himself. And we don't really know which it is. But if Jesus is applying it to himself, it would seem like that's the confirmation that Jesus is really like fully, like not bought in is not the right terminology, but is like fully like grounded in this idea of being God's son. So if that's what he was saying, that's meaningful. Micah and Peter, how do you read that bit? You shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Do you think it would be referring to just God the Creator, or could it be Jesus too?
Such an interesting like way to think about that, because I think this is again kind of immediately following the baptism, right? Jesus's baptism. There is this declaration from God the Creator, this is my son. And so there is and the fact that everything is sandwiched in where it's at and like the placement in the story, I think there's a very strong case to say that Jesus is kind of referring to both. Like, don't basically saying for self, maybe even addressing the human parts, because if we kind of go like the idea of some of the traditional understandings of Jesus as fully God and fully human, maybe even addressing the human parts of self and saying, don't tempt God, and addressing the devil in this moment and saying, don't tempt me. So there is this really, there's a lot of nuance and duality here that's really interesting.
Yeah.
And that last question really is like about his humanity too. So it feels like it is, because, you know, he's mortal. He can be harmed. Like if, you know, he falls off the highest point of the temple, it's not going to be great.
Right.
So I feel like maybe
and he's hungry, also a very like mortal thing.
Yeah, he's very much in his, like, you know, his humanity as well right now. So it does feel like a sort of like one of the first times you kind of see him fully acknowledging or embodying both, or like stepping into both.
Yeah. I see Carolyn connecting these words from the Passion narrative about when Jesus is being crucified and people say, let him save himself if he's the Messiah. And there's that sense of like, if you say you have all this power, why don't you use it? And yeah, I like that connection, Carolyn, because there's also the connection here in verse 13 where it says the devil departed until an opportune time. So like, that's very like foreshadowy of like the devil will be back in part 2. So I like the connection there.
There's also a really interesting parallel here that we'll be talking about a little bit in verse 23. We'll get to where Jesus even says, like, doubtless you'll quote to me this proverb, doctor, cure yourself. So this like sense of like testing that is continuing to happen. And yeah, so it's really interesting. Thank you for pointing that out, Carolyn, because that kind of puts that theme of that ongoing kind of sense of like living into identity and testing and in a new context for me.
I wonder for Micah, for Peter, for everybody, do you see the end of like this first 13 verses? Do you see Jesus walking out of this time of temptation feeling like strengthened and sure about like who he is and what he's supposed to do? Or is there room to imagine a Jesus who's still kind of unsure even after this experience? What do y'all think?
That's a great question. I feel like the way I was taught about this story, I was definitely taught that like this was like a huge victory moment for Jesus, and then, you know, he like can then enter into his earthly, you know, the like public part of his ministry with confidence. But like, I don't know, he's still really hungry. Like I feel like that sounds like a really exhausting experience. So I'm not really sure. I kind of like the idea that you know, I guess that experience of like feeling very confident in your identity some moments, and then the next moment finding it really hard to kind of hang on to that.
Yeah.
I can imagine Jesus having that experience, especially since, as we've been talking about, he's really kind of feeling the limitations of his humanity right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that reminds me, for folks, I was just looking up because I wanted to remember his name. Dante Stewart, who recently wrote a book called, I think it's called No Shouting in the Fire, if I'm correct on that. I'm pretty sure. But Dante Stewart is his name. He is a pastor who spoke last weekend at Evolving Faith. If anybody was at Evolving Faith, it's a conference for sort of like Christians that are trying to figure out what they believe in the midst of a confusing world. And Dante spoke about the Mark version of this story. And he talks about how in Mark's version, I think Mark's version, there's basically, no, hang on, I'm getting it wrong. It's not Mark's version. Maybe it's Matthew. I forget. It's in all the synoptics, so they get a little confusing. And we're going to talk about some differences there. But there's one version of this story where the story is basically like 2 sentences long. And it just talks about Jesus going into the wilderness to be tested and being with the wild animals and angels waiting on him. And that's like the whole story. So that makes me think it's Mark, because it's so short. But that Dante was talking about how there are moments in life that can confirm who you are and your sense of self. And that feels like really wonderful. But at the same time, you're going through this intense testing process that feels awful, and you're being like put through something you've never really been through before. And so he was just talking about sort of the push and pull between being blessed in this one way and afflicted in this other way, and being confused because it all seems to be coming from God. Like, how do we make sense of that? So just shout out to Dante Stewart, because he, I think, put that really well, that this sense of like, even if Jesus is really sure of himself walking out of this story, he's still hungry, and we don't really know like how he deals with the recovery from being for 40 days in the wilderness, you know?
Yeah. I really like, I see in the chat, Jolene Snow said, I wonder if it was a feeling similar to when Jacob wrestled with God, strengthened, but with a limp, which,
Yeah.
yeah. And I love that idea of there can be this beautiful bit of testing, and like the trial and hardship can form us in incredibly powerful ways, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a cost or a lasting impact on us in hard ways too. And so I think, just thinking about that, I think as queer and trans folks, we definitely relate to like the incredible, like it's the wilderness experience of figuring out our identity and starting to come out to folks and trying to navigate all of that. And it is beautiful, it's empowering, it's incredible. And also there can be loss, there can be ways that we're still figuring it out and we haven't like fully, there's ups and downs. It's not a fully black and white thing. And so thank you for those ideas. And catching up a little bit too, Carolyn, the metaphor a bit of a reach, but I'm thinking of how buildings can move and withstand the wind and earthquakes, but brittle and unmovable buildings can crumble, and like how moving in the wind is a sign of strength. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see Amory mentioning too the idea of this whole story where we're told in verse 1 that this is Jesus returning from the Jordan River. So this is the Jordan River Valley, and Amory is pointing out that it, like, especially with this moment of Jesus like being able to see the whole land in front of him, reminds Amory of the contemporary situation with Israel and Palestine and the war that's happening and the genocide that's happening there now. So it's a clear moment, I think, where we can look at a story and it's easy for us to go, this happened a million years ago. Even if there's relevance to today, it's all metaphorical relevance, you know, but like this is talking about a part of the world that is being affected right now by faith communities that look at these texts as important or relevant in some way. So, yeah, I definitely hear you, Amory. That's definitely something we've been thinking a lot about lately. As we're looking at these texts, I mentioned about how there's like this story shows up in the synoptics, and there's a couple of different things that are different in the different iterations of this story in Matthew and Mark and Luke. So there's a couple of interesting notes, I know, Micah, that you have.
Yeah. We were behind the scenes, we're calling these our weird notes, where we're just like noting interesting differences and things. As Austin mentioned, it is Mark. It's 2 verses. And it's essentially Jesus was taken out of the wilderness, tested, and angels waited. And then interestingly in Matthew, so in Luke, the temptations are first for food, second for authority, and then third for protection. But interestingly, the second and third temptations in Matthew are actually switched. So it's food, then protection, then authority. So it's interesting. I wonder, like, I'm just curious about how that impacts the reading of like the actual stories, and in because Matthew does focus a lot on the kind of authority, like that sense of authority of Jesus and the identity and leaning into that. So it's really interesting thinking about how that could be, that could affect the interpretation. And then another quick weird note before we leave this section of the passage. Amory, I know that you mentioned earlier that you were in the Greek interlinear. And so you might have like noticed this in the Greek, but the word for the devil here in the Greek is actually diabolos, which is that is actually an adjective. It is not a noun. And so, but when combined with like ho diabolos, it becomes like it turns the adjective into a noun. So it's just really interesting. Diabolos means slanderous. So it's an adjective that means slanderous. So this could be like the slanderous one if you were to like read it extremely literally. So I just find it interesting how that has become established in many different Christian traditions as the devil as like a specific figure. And it may be a specific figure, but also there's ways that people can also interpret it as a figure in general that serve the purpose of being slanderous or for testing. So it's just interesting.
Yeah, I had a note about that in my, I always like looking through, when we look at these New Testament passages, I really like looking through my Jewish annotated New Testament, because it makes a point of going through the New Testament with Jewish scholars who are also New Testament scholars, talking about the points where there may be resonance between Jewish tradition and like Christian understanding of the text. And they had a footnote in it that talked about how during like the time of Jesus and what became sort of eventually the sort of Talmudic period as that was being sort of put together, there's this understanding of the devil as a character that is part of the heavenly court and serves as a like has an intentional place. Like the devil's purpose is like part of God's purpose, but it's to like test people. And that's a really interesting point of theology. I don't know if I like it or don't like it. I like that it's like, well, this is within God's purview and that there's a place for everything. I don't like the idea that God was like, but we must have somebody whose job is to be a jerk. So I don't know. It's an interesting, this could either be a specific sort of proper noun character who's the same throughout other stories, or this could just be somebody enacting a role of some kind. Interesting note. Okay, well, we have to move from this first section because we're going to get into our second section here. We are moving from this moment where we have Jesus saying, "You shall not put the Lord your God to the test." And then when the devil had ended every temptation, he departed from him until an opportune time. And the next section is verses 14 through 20. So I'll read that one for us. And again, I'm reading out of the English Standard Version. So 14 through 20 goes like this. Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit to Galilee, and a report about him went out through all the surrounding country, and he taught in the synagogues, being glorified by all. And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. As was his custom, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood up to read. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll and gave it back to the attendant and sat down. and the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. So we have this moment where Jesus goes from the wilderness, and we're told in verse 14 he returns in power, or in the power of the Spirit, to Galilee. So clearly Jesus is like, whatever happened in the recovery sort of section, he's now like back at like full power, full battery, and he's ready to go. And he starts showing up in the synagogues, and then he preaches his first big sermon in a synagogue. So yeah, I guess this kind of starts to bring forward the question that we're asking tonight, which is, or it asks the question that brings us to our topic tonight, which is like, why is this relevant? Why are we talking about this story? What is the point of this story? So Peter, talk to us a little bit about why we're making a connection between this story and trans and queer experiences.
Yeah, we're calling this section Jesus is Coming Out, right?
Yeah.
So I think there are a lot of just points of connection here with the experience of like coming to understand yourself fully, particularly like coming to understand your trans and or queer identity. Jesus returns. He's, filled with the power of the Holy Spirit. Everyone's talking about him. Everyone's noticing. And I think this is an experience that a lot of us will probably relate to, which is, we embrace our authentic selves. We are, comfortable in ourselves for the first time, and people notice. And that can be a good thing, or it can be a neutral thing, or it can be sometimes a really uncomfortable thing, depending on kind of like the ways in which people pay attention. So I think that's kind of like, a point of connection for us as we like observe this experience that Jesus is having.
Yeah, it makes me think of how many people came out after the pandemic lockdowns. That there's something about the isolation of like going out, and like Jesus's isolation is in the wilderness of like, you're isolated, you're thinking about stuff, you're suddenly like, oh my gosh, maybe there's some stuff I gotta unpack. And then you come out of that isolation into community and people go, what?
Yeah.
That's such a great analogy to draw on, because that's so interesting that we have that contemporary experience of that sense of isolation. Then and even for folks, like I had been out a little bit like to people beforehand, but when I started hanging out with friends, they're like, something's different. Like there was a recognition of difference because there was this time away to like spend with God, with myself, with like some close people in my community that really did make an impact. So it's really, thank you. I love that.
Yeah, well, I mean, even if you were out to folks pre-pandemic, I think for anybody who started coming out, or maybe started transitioning in some way pre-pandemic, like near the start of the pandemic, then there were like a year and a half where we just didn't really see each other. So then when you see each other again, you're like, whoa, you have changed.
That was my story. Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, Micah, I think you have some thoughts about this passage where Jesus is reading from Isaiah.
Yeah, and I see Carolyn just posted about the part of Isaiah he reads is really similar to the Magnificat. Mm-hmm. And I like that repetition in Luke about the freeing the oppressed. Yes, absolutely. So as a note, this is taken from Isaiah 61. There are some interesting translation differences here, which I won't go into the details here, but there's a line that's left out from what it shows in Isaiah to what gets here. And there's also an interesting thing in Isaiah 61:2. There is a line that says, it goes to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance to our God. But here Jesus actually doesn't go, and he stops right before saying the day of vengeance to our God. So I'm just curious what you all think about, one, why Jesus chose this passage as his coming out. Like if we're thinking about this in terms of coming out and revealing, why this passage? Like what is it revealing about Jesus? And also like if you have any thoughts about why Jesus chose to stop at that point and not continue further.
It's so funny because normally I hate when people do that. Normally it drives me a little bit bonkers when I like a sermon is being preached and the pastor stops like mid-verse and I'm just like, wait a minute. there's more there that we need to take into account. So it's funny because this is like a pet peeve of mine. Right, Jesus did it first, so I guess they have they have precedent. But yeah, it bugs me. But like, I also get it. If Jesus is trying to give this beautiful sermon, um, it's I mean, it's funny because if he had included the line about and the day of vengeance for our God or to our God, like if he had included that, it almost, this is like foreshadowing, almost makes a little bit more sense why people end up so aggravated at the end if we're already talking about if the idea of vengeance has been included. But Jesus doesn't even include the idea of anything like that. So I mean, maybe it's the kind of thing like when you come out and when you're first trying to like talk to people about stuff, you really only include the good stuff because you're so nervous that they're going to react badly that you're like, we're just going to skip over all the stuff that is like hard or complicated. Like, I'm going to give you the easiest version to swallow. Maybe that's what Jesus was doing.
What do you think, Peter? Any thoughts on this, or anyone in the chat too?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting that this is the passage that they're responding to. It's, you know, about liberation and healing, and they're like, I'm mad about that. uh, it just, yeah, it definitely reminds me of some experiences I have of, you know, like pointing to what you know, people getting distracted by yeah, basically like when you take things at their simplest terms, like take like what Jesus is preaching at its simplest terms, it can really make people upset. It's more challenging than it appears to be, you know.
It's super
Yeah.
challenging.
Yeah.
I found this quote I'd love to share from Robert Shore Goss in the Queer Bible commentary. Sorry, I just saw the corner of my eye. Amory said, "Coming out with a vengeance." That's great. I love that. But Robert Shore Goss in the Queer Bible commentary, I love the way that he ties the time that Jesus spends in the wilderness and the testing with this moment. And so he writes, Judean temple religion was co-opted by empire. And he's talking about in the context of Jesus's time. And it provided justification that provided abundant blessings for the elite at the expense of the many poor. In God's kingdom, there would be no hunger. Empires then and today argue for an ideology of scarcity to benefit the elite. Income inequality and hunger insecurity plagued Jesus's time as well as our own. Scarcity is an economy of mammon, greed, and selfishness. The wilderness was where God demonstrated the abundance for all in creation. There is always enough, for everyone shares with one another. There, Jesus, he's talking about in the wilderness, Jesus embodies the wildness of the spirit, which would challenge empire and the co-opted Jewish elite. In Nazareth, he recites from Isaiah a countervision from the Spirit's anointing. So I love the way that like it's this shaping and forming of Jesus. And imagine like you're being tempted with food for 40 days and you survive that. Like can you imagine how that would shape and change your mindset? And I think it's really familiar to when I was thinking about this, and I really like this because when we go through those times of identity formation or something really shapes and changes us, whether it's in our queer identity or trans identity or other identities, like we begin to see the places where empire is not really serving us anymore. And like it like changes our relationship to it. So like, I really love that in this moment where this is Jesus's hometown where he probably was really familiar with the people. All of a sudden, the way he might relate to those people, it may not be the same. And I just really liked how that was summed up in this quote.
Yeah, it's interesting too that Jesus is not like, there are times throughout the rest of the Gospels where Jesus does preach or do other activities in the temple proper, right, in Jerusalem. But in this particular case, Jesus is in a synagogue, which was a community hub that was not connected to, I mean, like it was a religious center that also functioned as like the social center of the community. It didn't have the sense of like pomp and circumstance of the temple, you know? So there's also something about Jesus choosing to go not to the temple where I think people would generally expect the Messiah to just sort of hang out all the time. Jesus is like, no, I'm out in like the community center. So yeah, I like that. I like that connection for sure. I know that you had a quote as well, Peter, from Jonah Overton, on this, who is a pastor that just recently preached about a version of this story.
Yeah, so this quote is actually from Unbound, which is different queer reflections on the entire Gospel of Mark. They go through chapter by chapter with different theologians, writers, thinkers talking about each chapter. So Jonah Overton is my pastor at Zao MKE Church, and they did just recently preach on this, but they also wrote this reflection in Unbound, drawing the connection really closely to the idea of coming out. And then kind of, I think, looking ahead to the next part of this passage too, which is,
Right.
the negative response that Jesus experiences from his own home and his own community. So I'll just read a bit from Jonah's reflection. Too many of us know this story in the pit of our stomachs that catch in our throats. Despite the structures that demand our performance of straightness, of cisness, of the binary, we somehow found an out. We discovered closeness, connection, identity, and language for who we truly are. We find our true kin and we choose one another. And then we go home. We try to explain the miracles we've experienced. Some are amazed, some are merely surprised, some scandalized, some repulsed. They built these closets for us and they won't let us so easily leave the wreckage. Who are we anyway to tell them what it means to be free, to be whole? That might require them to examine their surroundings, to see their role in our captivity, or worse, in their own. Too often we are literally disbelieved. It's a phase, we hear. God doesn't make mistakes, they say. There are only two genders, someone grumbles. We expend so much energy trying variously to convince, placate, or fight them. Perhaps we could simply find validation and rest in what Jesus says next. Prophets are honored everywhere except in their own hometowns, among their relatives, and in their own households. And this reflection is definitely worth reading in its entirety too. So I know we'll pop the link into the video after we're done here. But yeah, just really that direct parallel in this experience of Jesus of stepping into something that's so like such a joy-filled thing of discovery, and then having like encountering this kind of response from the people who have formed him and who he's been closest to.
Yeah. So we're going to get into sort of this response that people have to Jesus. I think one of the questions that we can ask ourselves is, with Jesus coming back to his hometown and knowing that he's maybe going to say something that people aren't going to be thrilled about, or he's going to show up in a way they don't love, what do you think enables Jesus to make this sermon? Like what gives him the courage or the sort of wherewithal to stand up and do this? Because he could have read a different passage, he could have shown up differently, he could have not gone home at all. There's like lots of different ways that Jesus could have shown back up in the world after this time in the wilderness. What do you think gives him the courage to do this thing?
I go back to verse 14. Then Jesus in the power of spirit returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread through all the surrounding region. Like, if we're seeing right before this, there's this time in the wilderness, there is this sense of like God, like one, the sense of perseverance and the shaping in the intense time, but also even before that with the like Jesus's baptism and the Holy Spirit descending and God saying, "This is my beloved son." There is a sense of like strength that comes in knowing who you are, and also having that seen by others, especially by God. And so I think that strength of, this is who I am, and I know God sees me this way. I think that is an incredibly strong source of strength in those times of having to face and having to like face people we know or face people we may not know, and say, this is who I am. Yeah, I just love the way that it flows in Luke, from this is who you are, Jesus, to now this is, and then Jesus is like, this is who I am.
Yeah, I know a lot of folks have had experiences of feeling like God, of feeling sort of God saying to them, like, I see you, I know you, I love you exactly the way you are, and like it's okay and it's good to be who I created you to be. And the strength of that experience often will get them through those difficult moments afterwards, because you've had that sense of like, okay, God gets it, so now I can do difficult things with people. I see a couple of other ideas here in the chat. Amory says that it's because of Jesus's absolute love for God's people. I can definitely see that. If you're coming out of this wilderness experience and you know you have this thing that is like your calling, and you said your vocation, your love for the people around you often will be why you share yourself with them, because you want to still be in connection with them, right? Carolyn says that maybe Jesus was asking, what else do I have to lose after 40 days in the wilderness of not eating? Possibly. Possibly. And yes, Jolene is pointing out that it's got this sort of 3 acts: the calling, and the testing, and the proclamation. Definitely some real good writing chops that Luke has, for sure. Yeah, and a similar pattern later in the story of Pentecost. So yeah, definitely all of these things definitely possible. Let's move to our last part of the story then, which is verses 21 through 30. So we've got Jesus proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor. And of course, in answer to your question earlier, Micah, about like why would Jesus pick this particular passage, it's very convenient that this verse says, because he has anointed me. And anointed is, of course, the word from which we get Christ, right? So like, makes sense. So Jesus has just proclaimed that he is anointed, and all the eyes of the synagogue are fixed on him. So Micah, do you want to start with verse 21?
Yes. This is from the NRSV. Then he began to say to them, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, is this not Joseph's son? He said to them, doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, doctor, cure yourself. And you will say, do here also in your hometown the things that we have heard you do in Capernaum. And he said, truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them except a widow widow Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many with a skin disease in Israel in the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian. When they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way.
A lot happening in this last part of this particular story.
Yes.
A lot going on with people's response to Jesus. So what is Jesus? There's kind of a turning point, it seems like. It's 2 sort of possible turning points that make sense of why people respond negatively. The first one is when they say, isn't this Joseph's son? And then the second one is when Jesus refuses to do miracles there, or at least maybe he doesn't refuse, but says it's not going to happen for one reason or another. So there's 2 points that like could make sense of the turning. What do you think about this? Aren't you Joseph's son bit, Micah?
Yeah, I think, I was like, as we're thinking about Jesus coming from identity, this idea of Jesus's identity and of as Son of God, and all of a sudden, isn't this Joseph's son? It's like this return to, but we knew you as this way before. I don't know if, I'm sure you might have had an experience of after coming out and transitioning, going to someone and be like, oh, but I will always know you as. So that sense of, but we isn't this so and so, or isn't this like, so like, I can just imagine the talk of the town and how this is not who we thought you were. And it's really interesting that Jesus's response there is about like, doubtless you'll say, doctor, cure yourself, and you'll say, do you hear? And Jesus is not about like to prove himself, which is interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that conflict, or I mean, I don't know whether to read into the story a sense of conflict between Jesus as Joseph's son versus Jesus as God's son, right? Because like we've had like multiple stories now where Jesus as God's son is like fully affirmed, and then we get this bit about like, isn't he Joseph's son? And so it's easy for me to read that and go, well, Jesus must have been really solid about being God's son and not Joseph's son. So sort of the either or. But I kind of wonder if maybe Jesus was okay having two dads. Like maybe Jesus didn't feel like he had to choose one or the other. Maybe he can be both God's son and Joseph's son, and both can be true. I don't know.
Yeah, I was wondering if like if you might feel any sort of sense of like conflict between those. I see Emery says our old identity persists. And Caroline, I see I don't know geography
that
well.
I'm getting to that.
Oh yeah,
I'm so
go
excited
for it.
to talk about
yes.
that. Yes. So Carolyn points out that the widow at Zarephath and Naaman the Syrian, Carolyn points out, are both considered foreigners. So they would be Gentiles, right? So both the people that Jesus references in what he's talking about here are times when the prophets of Israel went and healed and helped people who were not the people of Israel. And so Jesus is pointing out, like, there were plenty of sick people in Israel. There were plenty of people that needed food in Israel, but these prophets were called to go give their gifts outside of that. And so he makes this point about like those connections with Gentiles, with people that were not part of the community of Israel at the time. Both of those stories are also about subverted expectations. So if you remember the story of the widow at Zarephath, basically what happens is the heavens are shut up, as we're told in this story. So there's a famine in the land, there's no food. And this widow is out gathering she's gathering sticks to cook the last of her meal into little cakes for her and her son to eat before, like, that's the last of their food, and they're going to die of starvation after that. So she's out picking up sticks to cook their last meal, and she meets the prophet Elijah, who comes and ends up giving them all the meal and oil that they need to keep eating this sort of baked bread until the famine is over. So like but when Elijah meets this woman, this widow, she kind of laughs him off. She's kind of like, well, we're about to die, and that's just the way things are. And Elijah's like, well, I'll help. And she's like so set in her sense of like, nope, this is the end, that for a while she can't realize what Elijah is saying. So she's got this expectation of here's how things are going to be, and any change to that throws her off. The story of Naaman the Syrian is very similar, where Naaman has a skin disease and he goes to the prophet Elisha. He travels all the way from Syria to see the prophet Elisha to be cured. And Elisha won't even come out of his house to see Naaman. Elisha sends his servant out, and the servant says, go wash in this river over here that's like right next door. Go wash in this river and you'll be clean. And Naaman is like so certain that he has to be cured by the prophet Elisha, that like he has to be touched by Elisha, that he's like, absolutely not. I'm not going to go bathe in this gross river. We've got rivers back in Syria that I can bathe in if I want to, and they're way better. And so Naaman is like so stuck in this idea of like, I have to be touched by the prophet Elisha or it's not going to work, that he can't see the way that healing actually is showing up. So when Jesus references these two stories, I think there's two things going on. He's pointing to the fact that Jesus is called to people outside the community of Israel. And he's pointing out that when we get so stuck in our sense of this is the story, this is who you are, and I can't see beyond that, we lose the bigger picture, and we can't see what's actually happening and like the miracles that we're actually experiencing. So I love that Jesus talks about these two stories because they're like classic Old Testament stories. So I'll get off my Old Testament soapbox now, but I really appreciate that Jesus mentions both of those stories.
You will never get off your Old Testament soapbox. That's not possible.
And it's okay. We love it. So
so true. Yes. Okay. Carolyn, we are going to come back to that cliff thing too, so we won't forget. But one other thing I want to say about Jesus's response to the people here. And it's a connection to, I don't know if y'all know Father James Martin, who wrote a book called Building a Bridge, which is specifically about like being an affirming Catholic. So Father James Martin's like pretty famous for that. He wrote this book and then got a lot of flack for it. And so somebody was interviewing him for a book that they were writing about his life, and he told this story about being on a retreat and meditating over this story of Jesus's rejection at Nazareth and trying to figure out like how to deal with possible rejection. So Father James Martin said, in prayer, I asked Jesus, how were you able to do this? How were you able to put up with rejection? I really wanted to know how Jesus dealt with the contempt. And in prayer, I heard Jesus say to me, must everyone like you? It was one of the few times that I've heard, not physically, but rather in my head, such a clear statement in prayer. And of course, at that point in my life, I would have said yes. So he continues to talk about like dealing with the blowback after his book was published from people that do not think that you should be affirming if you're Catholic. And recognizing that there are times, even for like Father James Martin, who's not a queer person, where like we are called to something that is going to mean that people aren't going to like us and that they're not going to like what we're saying. But we feel this calling anyways. And so I connected that a little bit, I think, with just feeling a comfort in knowing that Jesus knows what it's like to experience rejection. That like so many of us experience that, especially rejection for who we are or what we're called to do. And it's nice to be able to think like, okay, you can ask Jesus how he got through it, because maybe he'll have some interesting wisdom, such as, does everybody have to like you? So I appreciate that. We also have another really good reflection from Dwayne Davis. Peter, I think that you've got that one.
Yeah, kind of connected to some of the things we've been talking about, like specifically about the sort of scandalized response that people have to what Jesus is saying, and how we can kind of think of that as a model in terms of like our own preaching and our own like proclamation of these truths. And, you know, often it's going to lead to that kind of response. So Dwayne Davis says, even as the Gospels provide accounts of the content of Jesus' teaching and preaching by relaying the words attributed to Jesus, the evangelists who wrote the Gospels also provide colorful descriptions of what people thought of what they were hearing. They were amazed and astonished at this teaching. References Matthew 7:28 through 29, Luke 4:32, which is this passage, and Mark 1:22. His rhetoric was different and the effect dramatic and immediate. Clearly, Jesus did not rely on or feel compelled to use the values, rhetoric, or commitments of the empire or the religious establishment in proclaiming the kingdom of God. His proclamation was not conditioned by the world's system of domination and oppression or its lack of imagination about God's diverse humanity. His words were not controlled for the purpose of promulgating the myths and narratives of national purpose and greatness. Preaching with a queer hermeneutic gives us an opportunity to free our rhetoric and proclamation from the values, rhetoric, and commitments of a world that relies too much on the authority of assimilation, classification, and categorization to make sense of difference. This kind of preaching is an invitation to recapture the radicality of God's grace, recognizing that we may have historically placed too much emphasis on being theologically orthodox rather than being surprised and transformed by Jesus' scandalous, liberating, and prophetic gospel.
Ooh, that's so good.
Yeah.
I especially like what Reverend Dr. Davis talks about with this idea of us being liberated to be changed by what we are hearing. That when Jesus says something that is so wild to us or is so surprising or calls us into something different, we are allowed to be changed by that.
Yeah.
And
Surprised
the church is, yes, surprised and transformed. And the church is allowed to be surprised and transformed, which is even harder for institutions to change, even than individual people, I think.
I love the part where it says, clearly Jesus did not rely on or feel compelled to use the values, rhetoric, or commitments of the empire or the religious establishment in proclaiming the kingdom of God. And that's like, that it's surprising. Like it's and I love the fact that that feels really liberating in the sense of like, we don't have to like we don't have to argue on other people's terms, right? So like for our own liberation, for the liberation of the oppressed, like
Yeah.
liberation of the oppressed is argued on the terms of the people that need that liberation. And so like it changes where the center is, and I really like that.
Well, it's encapsulated in Jesus's response, because the people want to argue with him and then want to hurt him, and his response is not to argue and not to fight back. His response is to just make a way through the crowd and go do what he was planning to do anyway.
Such a great image. He passed through the midst of them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. One final weird footnote we've got on verse 29. Who has that? Do I have that?
I think you have that.
Another weird footnote on verse 29. So in terms of placement of like what's going on here, Amory was talking in the chat earlier about how there's a current place in the Holy Land where the sort of the temple, like where Jesus would have been placed during the temptation, etc. So like that's a very physical location, and we can kind of see what's going on there, right? Or imagine what's going on there. But the interesting thing about the city of Nazareth is that Nazareth itself is not built on a cliff. There's no cliff in Nazareth. So I had this funny thing where I was reading through this passage in my Bible, and then the footnote just said, it was like end of the passage, and then the footnote that just said, Nazareth is not built on a cliff. And it was just such a funny moment of like mic drop of like trying to imagine yourself in that place. So it brings us, I think, an interesting question at the end of our time here. We're going to get to our actual final thought in a minute, but it does make us question how do we deal with it when our geography or other things make us question how these stories are told. It doesn't necessarily mean that these stories didn't happen, or that they did happen for sure, or that they happened in a way that was ontologically different. But it does help us think more about like how can we imagine the storytelling and the rhetoric of the way these stories are told, and how much that plays into the meaning of the story itself. So just an interesting weird note to go there. We do have a sort of afterword for how we're thinking about how this connects with our lives. So Peter, I think you've got a quote on this.
Yeah, this was from the Queer Theology podcast. Ryan Murphy was talking about this passage and basically how it allows us to reflect on how we respond when we encounter this kind of rejection of who we are and like the calling of God in our lives. And he says, I think that there's this really important line that we have to walk between when we follow the way of Jesus, people are going to want to throw us off a cliff, right? And also not seeking out persecution for the sake of being persecuted to make us feel more holy or more righteous, or as like, I'm so persecuted, and that is an indicator of my faithfulness or my wokeness or my progressiveness or whatever it is, my holiness. Like you were saying, Jesus passed through the crowd and he went on his way. He left. He didn't stay and let them continue to beat up on him and actually throw him off of the cliff, or try and throw him off of a cliff. At some point you have to be, okay, I'm going to move on and try something new. So that just felt like a helpful reminder too of exactly what we were saying, is that, Jesus didn't allow them, it wasn't going to continue, like you were saying, like a melody, to like take things on their terms. He was going to just continue on and like proceed along the way that God was calling him. And if that meant leaving some people behind, then that's what he was going to do.
Yeah.
And I think probably still, because he was still connected to these folks, hoping that eventually maybe they would follow. But you don't have to wait for them to catch up necessarily all the time.
Yeah.
I think this sort of takeaway thought for what we're talking about today is this sense of like, how do we respond when we experience rejection because of who we are and what we're called to do? I think this is a great model for one way that we can respond to it. And even if this model doesn't speak perfectly to our lives or our circumstances, there's something about knowing that Jesus has experienced this that allows for a connection, like a continual relationship with a God that understands what this is like and can talk to us about it. So it's an important story. there's so much that we didn't have time to get to tonight. I see Jeannie's great comment about the year of the Lord's favor and Jubilee. I see some great comments from Carolyn about how Jesus responds with love. So there's a lot we didn't get to tonight, but I'm glad that you all were here to share this passage with us and let us share it with you. A couple of final announcements before we finish for the night. First announcement is that the next Bible Study Live is on November 15th. So be here for that. We're getting toward the Advent and Christmas season, so that's going to be exciting. And then the other thing is that this is my last Bible Study Live with you all, which is a sad thing, but also a happy, good thing. For those that haven't been keeping up with our leadership transition here at TMC, we are super excited to be bringing Micah Melody and a new person who you're going to meet very soon in as co-executive directors for TMC. So they're going to be taking over for me as I experience a season of rest and renewal that I very much need.